Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member and the members of this committee. Almost exactly 1 year ago today, I was here as the Rules Committee took up a highway bill that was developed entirely by the majority and that passed both the committee and the House along mostly partisan lines. After that, it went nowhere and Congress had to pass a 1-year short-term extension. I hope that the Speaker had learned that successful legislating depends on partisanship, on bipartisanship, partnership and bipartisanship, not partisanship, especially after the majority in the House shrank to just a few members. But clearly I was wrong, because here we are again today, kind of like Groundhog Day, about to do the exact same thing. Even worse, this bill is completely unpaid for, despite increasing the spending in the bill 11% from last year's partisan proposal. After leaders on both sides of the aisle from the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure met with the President earlier this year, and after the Speaker's calls for a bipartisan committee action, I stood ready for productive bipartisan discussions about how we could include Republican principles within the majority's framework. We could have found a compromise between their proposal and our Republican priorities as reflected in the Starter Act 2.0. Priorities that include common sense project streamlining, sufficient flexibility for our state and local partners, and equitable treatment for all of America's diverse communities, including rural America. Unfortunately, our attempts to move towards the majority's positions were not reciprocated in any meaningful way, and instead the majority moved even further away from us to accommodate the most progressive members of their caucus. Our Republican proposal provided historic levels of funding, moving substantially toward the majority's position. But instead of showing a willingness to negotiate, today's bill moved even further to the left, with an 11% increase over last year's bill. In addition, instead of working with us to find a compromise on the majority's climate priorities, now $1 out of every $2 in this bill is tied up in meeting the Green New Deal agenda. One of the clearest examples of how out of touch this bill is, it removes a once bipartisan ban on spending transit funds on art at transit stations. When you've actively categorized art as infrastructure, given the many needs across this country, you've clearly lost touch with what infrastructure Americans need. The worst part is that this partisanship is absolutely unnecessary. The Senate EPW committee, which includes members from both ends of the political spectrum, such as Bernie Sanders and Jim Inhofe, found common ground and unanimously approved their highway bill. The Senate Commerce Committee followed suit, overwhelmingly approving their own sections for a surface reauthorization. But here in the House, the majority is doubling down on last year's failed one-sided process. We're following the same roadmap to nowhere. It's my way or the highway all over again. In addition, the bill we are considering further evolved to add in wastewater infrastructure legislation considered by the committee. Last Congress, we had a bipartisan agreement on a wastewater infrastructure bill that authorized robust but realistic funding and common sense regulatory relief. And last month, we saw the Senate pass its bipartisan water infrastructure bill. 89 senators voted for a bill that committed $35 billion toward wastewater and drinking water investments. That bill was celebrated and endorsed by the White House. However, the House majority not only walked away from our bipartisan agreement last year, but then proposed new, unrealistically high authorization levels, more than $150 billion when you combine both the drinking water and wastewater components. Republicans have proposed bipartisan solutions based on last year's agreement and the Senate bill, but our willingness to work together has not been met in kind. I encourage my colleagues on this committee to oppose this rule, this bill, and this partisan process. And I'll end on this note. For 4 years, we consistently heard complaints from our Democrat colleagues that they couldn't negotiate with President Trump because they couldn't trust him. I'm worried that last week's bungled release and about-face on the bipartisan infrastructure agreement, which is not what we're talking about here today, has greatly hindered the ability of Congress and the White House to negotiate future bipartisan agreements. Even still, I hope that we can put this all behind us and start anew in providing bipartisan solutions for our country. Thank you for the time today, and I yield back.
Thank you.